Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about J.R.R. Tolkien and his works, whether it be The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, or whatever. And we have 15 questions to get through today that I've handpicked from the batch of questions that I've received in the past week, so let's get right down to it. First question, asked by Darko Markovic. I hope I'm saying that right. Who asks, Gandalf the White, who by his own words is weaker than Sauron in the Third Age, said, "Indeed, my friends, none of you have any weapon that can hurt me." But didn't Aragorn have Anduril with him, which cut Sauron's finger off? While it is true that Anduril, which was reforged from Narsil, harmed Sauron, it's also true that Gandalf the White stated, "Black is mightier." So you could sort of like apply a transitive property there, right? But there's two things that you're not taking into account. Well, really three things. But I'll get to the third thing as sort of like a minor quibble that I really don't think that transitive properties belong in fantasy literature. Or really any literature. But let's talk about the two things that are not being discussed. The first is that Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's finger when Sauron was pretty much dead on the ground. He'd been defeated by Earendil and Gil-galad, and while Earendil used Narsil in that battle, the fact is it's a lot easier to cut somebody's finger off or to do them great harm when they're lying there on the ground. So that's like, he was already defeated, so we have to kind of take that into account. The second thing, and I think this is the major thing, this is the big one, Gandalf has always sort of had a fear of Sauron and thought himself weaker, and that's part of it. But there's a more pragmatic reason why Gandalf said black is mightier still. He's the White Wizard, but he doesn't want Aragorn, Gimli, or Legolas, or anybody to believe that that's the end of their troubles, that they're going to win the war, because they're not going to win the war. They're not really trying to win the war through military might. Gandalf has been given additional power, but he's not there to tip the scales. That would run counter to the whole issue of what a wizard does, the whole purpose of the Istari. So, Gandalf says, black is mightier, there's a lot of work to be done. The only way that they could really win the war would be to use the One Ring, and they've already decided not to do that. They've already sent the ring on its way. It's already on its way to Mordor. They're not going to be recovering that and using the One Ring. So, Gandalf has set them on a course where they're going to fight a losing war with what he would refer to as a fool's hope that Frodo will destroy the ring, because he knows that if they did somehow win through sheer might, Sauron is not gone forever. The only way to get rid of him forever is to get rid of the One Ring. So, getting back to the whole transitive property idea, it sounds logical to say, well, if Gandalf says Sauron's stronger than him, then obviously Aragorn's weapon could harm him. But here's the thing, he's not talking, when he didn't say Sauron, he said black. He's the white, but the black is mightier. He's not just talking about Sauron, he's talking about the forces of evil here. He's talking about Mordor. That there's more evil than there is good, in him at least. Because, not saying that there's evil in him, that didn't come out right. That there's more evil in the world than Gandalf could hope to overcome. He's not there to solve everybody's problems. That's sort of like what Frodo's doing, and they're going to have to fight a war of distraction simply to help Frodo. And that's, what wind up happened. But I really don't like applying transitive properties to fantasy literature, or really any literature in general, because it is fantasy, and it's not meant to follow that sort of mathematical logic. And I think we get into this, this sort of like, this rut where we talk about who can beat who would win in a fight, who is the strongest, who is the weakest, let's rank them, let's do a tier list, what are their power levels. It makes me a little uncomfortable, and I think Tolkien would have hated it, because you're sort of missing the point. The characters aren't there to be analyzed in that sense. They're not meant to be classified. They're meant to be enjoyed. And you're supposed to take lessons from them, and it isn't about who has the greater statistics, you know? I think that Gandalf is probably smarter than I am. I'm going with what he said there. If he said that they don't have a weapon that can harm him, then they don't have a weapon that can harm him. If he says black is mightier, then black is mightier. And you can sit there and say, actually, but that was a completely different circumstance in a different age with different characters involved. So, you know, you have to take a lot of these things into consideration. Okay, next up. Did elves and humans have children in Middle-earth? Yes, there were a few times that elves and humans married and had children. It led to some complicated issues, but it all eventually worked out in the end. There was Beren and Luthien. They had a child named Dior. And there was Tuor and Idril. They had a child named Earendil. Now, while Tuor did become of the Eldar, he was originally a man. And the products of both of these couplings were human mortals, at least at first. So Earendil, along with Elwing, they traveled to Aman, which was actually forbidden to men under pain of death. But Manwë stated that as Earendil had elvish heritage, he would be spared. But he has to make a choice, whether he would become an elf or remain a man. He had the choice between immortality and mortality, and he wasn't allowed to return to Middle-earth. And I mean, he kind of did return to Middle-earth because he fought in the War of Wrath, but he was in his ship, and the words that Manwë used exactly were, you cannot walk amongst men or elves in Middle-earth anymore. So all of Earendil's descendants would have this choice, starting with his sons, Elrond and Elros. Elrond chose immortality, he became an elf. Elros chose mortality, he remained a man. All of the elves of the line, you know, could choose either. And Elrond's children had another exception there. They were deferred to make the choice until Elrond left Middle-earth. So they didn't have to make the choice until such a time as Elrond left, which was what started the Fourth Age. So, now it should be mentioned that Earendil's wife, Elwing, also had some human ancestry because she was the daughter of Dior, who was Beren and Luthien's son, and Nimloth, who was an elf. So, you know, it can get a little confusing. You know, there's a lot of family trees out there and such, but generally speaking, if an immortal and a mortal have a child, they're mortal, except in the case of all of Earendil's heirs. Now, this applied to a certain point because Elros was human because he chose to be, and then he married a human woman. So in that case, his children couldn't choose to be immortal. And then, of course, there was Aragorn and Arwen, who had at least one child in the Fourth Age, probably more, but we know of Prince Eldarion. And because Arwen had already given up her immortality, she was no longer an elf, because that's the difference between humans and elves, is immortality. There's no other difference, really. It's not a physical difference, it's a spiritual difference. So once an elf sheds their immortality, they're no longer an elf, they're human. So there was no choice there either, because Eldarion and any brothers and sisters that he may have had were the products of two human parents. So that's how that worked, for the most part. I'm grabbing my water here. Okay. All right, next question. What is the relationship between Sauron and Shelob in The Lord of the Rings? So, it's kind of funny. Sauron thought of Shelob as a pet. He called Shelob his cat. He didn't control her. She wasn't his servant, but he fed her. He was sort of like a feral cat that you sort of take care of, lead a bowl of food out, and they come back for the food, but you don't control them, right? You don't own that cat. So Shelob came to dwell on the border of Mordor a long time ago. She was fleeing the ruin of Beleriand at the end of the First Age, at the end of the War of Wrath. And she came to the tunnels where Cirith Ungol would eventually be, in an area of Mordor known as the Ethel Duath. And this was actually before Sauron had ever come to Mordor. So when he did come to Mordor, he was aware that Shelob was there. He was aware of her presence. And he didn't mind, because he had the Black Gate, and he had her. He had Cirith Ungol that he built there too, but her being there made it much more difficult for people to use that pass to sneak in to Mordor. She was sort of an excellent gate guardian. He hadn't appointed her as one, she was just there. So he did feed her in a sense, because there were prisoners that he just had no more use for, so he would have them driven into her lair to feed her. And this was an excellent way to get rid of people that Sauron didn't want around, and also keeping her fed stopped her from looking elsewhere to feed, so she would stay there. Now, for the part of Shelob, I don't think that she was ever aware of Sauron. We certainly don't know if she was aware of Sauron. She might have been, but I don't think she really cared. She was food motivated. Anything that came in, she ate. Except for Gollum, but that's a whole nother story. Okay. Next question. The Lord of the Rings. Well, this is not Lord of the Rings question. It's actually a Silmarillion question. How did Earendil happen to become a star? So, you might have heard Earendil. He was a mariner. Bilbo had a poem about him in The Lord of the Rings. He was Elrond's father. And then you hear about the star Earendil when Galadriel holds up her hand and the ring appears in front of the star. Earendil is not really a star as we understand it. He's not a celestial body, but in the sort of archaic mythological language that Tolkien likes to use, any bright point in the sky is a star. That's what a star originally meant, a bright point in the sky. So many have made a connection between the star of Earendil and the planet Venus, which was long believed by ancient peoples to be a star, and then, of course, eventually we discovered that it's actually a planet, not a star. Earendil is, of course, not a star, not a planet. He's an elf. He's in a flying ship. He guards the doors of night, which is pretty much the barrier between Arda, that's the world, and everything else, the universe, Ea. And upon his ship is one of the three Silmarils. And this is the light that you see in the sky. It's the Silmaril. So when Earendil's light is referred to as a star, linguistically, Tolkien is just referring to the fact that you can see the Silmaril in the sky. It's a bright point in the sky, not that the elf has become a celestial body. And because of what he's actually doing, he's guarding the doors of night. He's not actually even up in space, as we would understand it, but just very high up in the sky. Okay. All right, next question. How do you use the One Ring? How does one use the One Ring? To truly use the One Ring, not just wear it and you become invisible and you sneak around, that kind of thing, but to actually tap into its raw power, there are two things that are absolutely necessary, and one is not necessary but is helpful. So, the first thing that is 100% truly necessary is you must be powerful. The ring gives power according to stature. So to tap into the true power of the ring, you must grow great yourself. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be a mighty king or a fearsome warrior or a fair elf lord. You can prove how great you are through determination and will, which is what Frodo did. The second necessary thing that's required is that you must train your mind to dominate others. That's the words that Galadriel used, at least. Their meaning might be a little different from what you're imagining based on what she says of training your mind to dominate others. Frodo certainly did not do that. He did not spend his time training his mind to dominate others, but he did use the One Ring to issue a command to Gollum at Samath Naur. So, I think what Galadriel means is that you must be prepared. The true power of the One Ring is the power of domination, and that you must be ready, willing, and able to exercise that power. If you are not, the ring will not do much for you. So the third thing, it's not really necessary, but it's helpful. It helps to be evil. The One Ring is an evil instrument. Its power is not designed to be used for good. It can't lead to any good. It's wholly evil. Now, you may be fair. and still wield this foul power, but it would corrupt you. Your deeds would turn evil. It might happen slowly. It might happen right away. It depends on how good or bad you actually are. So in short, if you are a powerful, evil person who is ready, willing, and able to manipulate and dominate others, that's what the One Ring is for. Okay, let's get to the thumbnail pick, right? Every Tolkien scholar deals with this question ad nauseum. This is a variation of it, though. In The Lord of the Rings, couldn't the eagles fly the Fellowship to Rhûn or Khand to the east or south of Mordor so that they could go on horseback, and then everyone could sneak in from those directions unnoticed easily? All right, so, from time immemorial, people have asked, why didn't they fly the eagles there? And there are so many reasons why they didn't fly the eagles to Mordor. Sauron has an air force. It wouldn't have worked. The eagles are too big, too obvious. They would have been noticed. The ring could have corrupted the eagles. You're riding on, let's say, Gwaihir, and then suddenly he says, give me the ring or I drop you. There's so many different reasons why that wouldn't work and could never, ever work. Plus, the eagles wouldn't be interested in doing that, right? They have a will of their own. They answer only to Manwë, the king of Arda. They don't answer to Gandalf at all. They did him a favor a few times, but they don't answer to him. It doesn't work that way. So this one tries to mix it up by saying, well, what if instead of going to Mordor, they go around Mordor and then sort of sneak in? I mean, at least it's a variation, but it's still a very tiresome question. Tolkien answered this once. He answered, why didn't they fly the eagles to Mordor? And his answer was, shut up. So, there you have it. I'm not going to say shut up, though, but I will say that this scenario doesn't make any sense. The eagles fly everyone into, we'll say, Rhûn or Harad or Khand, which, by the way, are all territories that Sauron has occupied. All the people there are under his thumb, so to speak. And then they proceed on into Mordor on horseback, with horses that they get from where, exactly? Are the horses also being carried on eagles? But I digress, right? Why would the eagles do this? The eagles bore Gandalf a few times, always as a personal favor to someone. In The Hobbit, it was sort of hinted that the eagles owed Gandalf a favor, and Gandalf called in that favor. When going from Orthanc to Rohan, it was a favor for Radagast. And Gwaihir was very clear that he wasn't going to carry Gandalf very far. Certainly not as far as Lorien or Rivendell. So Gandalf said, well, just take me to Rohan, that will do. And then I'll get a horse. And it makes sense, because Rohan is where they have horses, right? The next time was after Gandalf had died and been resurrected, and Gwaihir took him from Ziraxigil to Lorien, and that was a personal favor for Galadriel. And it was a bit different, because Gwaihir noticed that Gandalf was a lot lighter. He wasn't a burden, and he didn't carry him on his back. He carried him in his claws, because Gandalf was basically barely conscious at that point. So the final time was when Gandalf asked Gwaihir and two of his eagles to fly him to Mount Doom to rescue Frodo and Sam. So this is really interesting, because Gwaihir says, I will take you wherever you want to go, no matter how heavy you are, even if you were made of stone. And I'm going to get into that at another point, but that was after the ring had been destroyed. But why would the eagles fly all the way around Mordor like that? They don't fly into danger. They don't carry people that far. They don't like to go too far from their own territory. So then let's say somehow magically this happens. Approaching Mordor from the east is a much longer trip, because Mount Doom is in the northwest section, and you would have to pass right by Barad-dûr if you're coming from the east, which is bad news. If you're approaching from the south, you would still have to contend with mountains, and then you would have to contend with the whole southern section of Mordor. This would be a much, much longer trip that has all of the non-combat section of Sauron's forces, the farmers and such. So it's kind of hard to sneak past that many people, whether they're slaves or orcs or whatever. And like I mentioned, Rune, Harad, Khand, all these areas were enemy occupied. News would get to Sauron pretty fast that a bunch of giant eagles were flying around there, and he would look into it. So it just wouldn't work. There's no scenario where the eagles make everything easier and sort of simple like that. Okay. All right, next question. Is Bilbo Baggins the most steadfast and strong character in The Lord of the Rings, considering he gave up the ring of his own volition? So, if we're measuring steadfastness and strength by the ability to give up the ring, which, I would agree you would have to be very steadfast and very strong to give up the ring, then I would say that Bilbo is the second, because there's also Sam, right? Sam is top dog there. Now, a lot of people like to point out that Bilbo had the ring for a much longer period. They say he's the only one who willingly gave up the One Ring after having it for a long period of time. And they're forgetting that Sam did have the ring. It was not a long period of time. Bilbo had it for 61 years. Sam had it for about a day. So it sounds like it's not really a fair comparison, but there's a few things to talk about here. For one, Bilbo never had the One Ring inside of Mordor, and that's where the ring was at its strongest and its most seductive. Sam's temptation was much greater. Bilbo wanted to keep the ring because he just wanted to have it. It had a hold on him. He'd had it for so long. He didn't want to give it up. And there's more to that, which I'm going to get into, but he wasn't being given visions like Sam was. Sam was being given visions that he would become a great hero and that he could make all of Middle-earth a garden. He was tempted. Bilbo, as far as we know, was not given any sort of delusions of grandeur by the One Ring. Another thing to consider is Gandalf's presence. He had to remind Bilbo that not only should he give up the ring, keep in mind that this was at a point where nobody knew that it was the One Ring, but that he had promised to. So Gandalf is sort of forcing Bilbo to live up to his word because he had said that he would give it to Frodo. Another thing is that the ring didn't want to stay with Bilbo. It had tried to abandon him many times, and that's why Bilbo kept it on a chain. In the case of Sam, the One Ring gave him some visions. It wanted to try to stick with him because Frodo was so bent on destroying it, and here was somebody new that maybe the One Ring might be able to work with, right? Of course, that didn't happen. Sam saw through it. He didn't agree that that was going to actually happen, and he knew that he should give it back to Frodo. And the visions are not something that is unique only to Frodo, because there was a point where Sam suggested that they share the burden between them, and in that moment, Frodo kind of freaked out a little bit because he saw Sam as an orc. So the ring can sort of play with your head a little bit there. The next thing to talk about is that Sam is actually the only person who bore the ring to directly hand it to somebody. Bilbo did not hand the ring to Frodo. He left it in an envelope. Okay, so that's a little different. It takes a lot more willpower to hand the ring to another person, knowing that they're not going to give it back to you, than it is to leave it in an envelope in your house and maybe have this thought of, I could possibly get it back at some point. And the last thing I'm going to address the length of time, the 61 years versus about a day. Gollum had the ring for like 500 years, right? And the ring was trying to get away from him. And it did so in several different ways. First, Gollum actually wore the ring constantly. And then eventually he found that he just couldn't bear to do that anymore. So he wore the ring on him in his clothing, like a pocket or something. And then it said that it galled him after a while. That was the words used in The Hobbit. So the ring can sort of make itself sort of unattractive to you in that sense. It can get away with you if it wants to. So Bilbo having the ring for 61 years actually probably made it easier, because the ring wasn't trying to stay with Bilbo, just like it wasn't trying to stay with Gollum. It's not trying to stay with any of these people. It's trying to get to Sauron. That's who it wants to be with. So there you have it. If your measure of steadfastness and strength is being able to give up the ring, then I think Sam is top dog, followed, of course, by Bilbo. Okay, this question was asked by Mark Hewis. Did H.P. Lovecraft's work influence J.R.R. Tolkien in any way? So, in short, we really can't say 100% for sure yes or no, because Tolkien never mentioned Lovecraft in that sense. He never said whether or not Lovecraft was an influence on his work. But if you ask me, or pretty much any other Tolkien scholar out there, the answer is going to be probably not. No. The only indication that we had that Tolkien read Lovecraft at any point was there was another author named Sprague de Camp. And Sprague de Camp gifted Tolkien a copy of the anthology book Swords and Sorcery. And that did include one of Lovecraft's stories, which was the doom that came to Samath. And de Camp had written an introduction to the anthology. So Tolkien was pretty scathing in his critique of Swords and Sorcery in a letter that was unpublished, but we have excerpts of it, and he sent it to de Camp. He said, "All of the items seem poor in the subsidiary, but not to me unimportant matters of nomenclature. Best when inventive, least good when literary or archaic." So the letter wasn't published, as I mentioned. We only have little excerpts from it, but it seems that Tolkien was basically saying he wasn't impressed with the stories in Swords and Sorcery, and they were poor. They might be inventive, but they were poor examples of literature or linguistics. Now, in his personal copy, there was another note that was unsent, and that one actually specifically critiqued the story Distressing Tale of Thangabrai the Jeweler, which was written by Lord Dunsery, and Lord Dunsery was one of the chief influences on H.P. Lovecraft. And Tolkien did not care for that story at all. So, if we were to say that he didn't like really many of the stories in there, and he specifically didn't like the story written by the one guy who influenced Lovecraft, we can guess that he probably didn't think much of Lovecraft's work and certainly wasn't influenced by it. And another thing to examine is that all of this literary critique happened around 1964. So The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were already published. So there's no indication of him having read Lovecraft earlier than that. He never spoke of Lovecraft. So, and furthermore, it just doesn't really fit. Like, there's nothing in Tolkien's work that feels like Lovecraft. Like, some people will talk about, like, The Watcher in the Water or the Nameless things, Ungoliant. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't feel like Lovecraft. I don't agree there. I think that Lovecraft has such a big footprint in the whole cosmic horror thing that whenever anybody talks about things without names or without shape, they immediately think of that. But Tolkien wasn't looking at horror writers or other fantasy writers. He was looking at mythology. So, if you want to look at an influence of his work, don't think Cthulhu, think Beowulf. Okay. Alright, next question. Is Gandalf crowning Aragorn a symbol that he represented the Valar, and crowning him is also gaining the Valar's approval and blessing to Aragorn's kingship? Yeah, this has always been the way that I saw it, that Gandalf specifically being the one to crown Aragorn was a clear endorsement of the Ainur. Well, Gandalf's identity as one of the Ainur was a secret. The cat was sort of out of the bag at this point. He'd already died and returned, and he was now the White. It's sort of like people pretty much knew at that point what he was all about. Now, if we examine Aragorn, he had a rather tenuous claim to the throne. It's not all that dissimilar from a claim made by one of his ancestors, Arvedui. Arvedui was Isildur's heir, which made him the king of Arnor, But to be the king of Gondor, you would have to be descended from Isildur's brother Anarion. And Arvedui's claim is that his wife, Firiel, was descended from Anarion, and therefore should have been the queen of Gondor, because that's how they did it in Numenor. Because Numenor would have queens, whereas Gondor would not have ruling queens. They would have a queen that would be the king's husband, but not a ruling queen. And originally, Numenor did it that way as well, but there was a king named Tar Aldarion, and he wanted his daughter Ankhalama to become the queen instead of his nephew Saranto becoming king, so he changed the laws. And, Arvedui's whole point was, if we're following Numenorian custom, then my wife should be the queen and I should be the king. And they told him, no, we're not doing that. So, Aragorn's claim to the throne, specifically of Gondor, still relies on the fact that he is descended from that union of Arvedui and Firiel. However, he managed to obtain the throne not just by being Anarion's heir, because he's only Anarion's heir through the female line, not the male line. The male line was severed. He instead fulfilled prophecies, and he obtained endorsements. He was endorsed by Rohan, by Rivendell, by Lorien, by Gondor, because the steward, Faramir, called him king. The final two pieces of the puzzle that made Aragorn feel at ease that he truly was the king of Gondor was Gandalf crowning him. That's the Ainur endorsing you. And then they traveled, Aragorn and Gandalf, and they found a blooming new white tree of Gondor, and or white tree of Numenor, you might even say. So that's essentially the planet endorsing him. So yeah, I always saw the fact that it was Gandalf specifically to be a spiritual endorsement. Okay, good question though. Okay, next one. If Sauron had recovered the One Ring, would he have been able to get a physical form? So Sauron does not need the One Ring to regain a physical form. He already has a physical form. He's regained his physical form a long time ago. He has the ability to forsake his body and generate a new one. Normally it would take not much time at all, but because he was weakened by losing the ring, it took him a little longer than average. But he had already reappeared as the Necromancer in Greenwood Forest, which of course became Mirkwood Forest. So he had a body. You just didn't see him because he spent the whole time in Barad-dûr sitting on his throne. Because that's the way Sauron operates. Alright, that was a quick one. Here's another question. What does Lothlorien mean? So, Treebeard stated the meaning of Lothlorien, which he felt was a hasty cinderization of the Quenya word Lorelin. He translated it as Dreamflower. So I might accuse the eldest here of being somewhat hasty himself. At least as a joke, I would say that. I think that he was trying to get to the point maybe a little faster for two young hobbits that were there. One can understand how Treebeard gets there. Lorien is a Quenya word that means dreamland, and Loth is Sindarin, and it means flower, or more particularly, it means blossom. So, Lothlorien, flower, dreamland, dreamflower. Other names in other languages suggest something different, though, right? And if we translate what Treebeard calls Lothlorien, Lorelin, it actually means Valley of Singing Gold. And if you look at the name of that land in other languages, it comes up as Valley of Gold, Vale of Gold. Sometimes the word singing is in there. In Nandarin, it's Lindorinand, which is Valley of the Land of Singers. So you sort of see a theme there, not Dreamflower, but Valley of Singing Flowers, Valley of Gold. And then we get to the translation of Lorien specifically, which can also be interpreted as golden wood. Now, I believe the most accurate translation of Lothlorien is Valley of Singing Gold. As far as what Treebeard was getting at with Dreamflower, I think he was, because he's so old, he was using an archaic literal translation, because one of the Valar, Irmo, was also called Lorien and is the Lord of Dreams, so he might have been thinking Lorien, Dream Flower. But I think Valley of Singing Gold makes the most sense when referring specifically to the land. Okay, next question. Could Tolkien's orcs write and read? They could, at least some of them could, and we learn of this in quite the grisly fashion. So there was a particularly nasty orc whose name was Azog, and he took up residence in Moria. And Thorin's grandfather, Thror, went to go investigate Moria, see what's up, and see if it was possible for them to retake Moria. Azog killed him, and he tossed his head at Thror's companion Nar, saying, "I will not have any more dwarven beggars at the doors of Moria." And to add insult to this, he even threw some coins at Nar. Like, here, get out of here. So Azog made it very sure that Nar would remember the name Azog because he carved it into Thror's head. So from this, we can infer that at least some orcs are literate, or at least can write their names. So, yeah, they definitely could read or write, or at least some of them could, based on that alone. Okay. All right, next question. How was the Shire managed? So the Shire actually has a pretty simple government. The main political leaders of the Shire were the Thane and the Mayor, and then there were sheriffs that were appointed below them. Above them was the King of Arnor. That's where it all started. The King of Arnor first gave hobbits who dwelt in Bree permission to use that land, and that's what became the Shire. And the laws of the Shire were the laws of Arnor. Now, after the King of Arnor ceased to be an office that was actually filled, they came up with the whole idea of a Thane to be sort of the king's representative, and they made the laws based off of the greater laws of Arnor. The Thaneship is passed from father to son. At the end of The Lord of the Rings, at least in the appendixes, we see that Peregrine Took becomes Thane after his father Paladin passes. The Thane's main role seems to be the actual leader of the Shire, but the managerial aspects go to the Mayor, which is called the Mayor of Meikle Delving, or just the Mayor of the Shire. Meikle Delving is, of course, the town that is the capital of the Shire. Now, in the times of peace, the mayor was mostly ceremonial role. He didn't have a whole lot to do. He appointed the sheriffs and that, but it was mostly just ceremonial. In the time of The Lord of the Rings, the mayor was Will Whitfoot, who he was captured by Saruman, and in his convalescence after the Battle of Bywater, he ceded the role to Frodo. Frodo was sort of the deputy mayor for a time until Will Whitfoot recovered. And then after Will Whitfoot stepped down, Sam Gamgee actually became the mayor, and he had an unprecedented 7 terms as mayor, and each term is 7 years long, so it's full 49 years as mayor. Then there were the sheriffs. They were like sort of the police of the Shire. Now, there wasn't really crime in the Shire that in the way that we would think of it. So the sheriffs spent less time policing the inhabitants of the Shire and more in ensuring its safety against outside antagonists and wildlife. Though when Saruman was in charge, he had the sheriffs doing much nastier things like seizing food and goods and tearing down buildings and just basically overseeing the ruination of the Shire. The sheriffs were appointed by the mayor, and the mayor also appointed a postmaster. You might imagine that's in charge of the mail. So, yeah, that's how it worked. In the Fourth Age, Aragorn II Elisar became the King of Arnor, and he told them, keep your Thane, keep your laws. He didn't change anything, really. He expanded the borders of the Shire. He gave them Bywater, Not Bywater, that was already part of it. He gave them Buckland. It was another B. Buckland, and he gave them Westmarch. And he instituted the ban on men because of what happened with Saruman and the ruffians. So men were not allowed to go into the Shire. And Aragorn even abided by his own law. I mean, when he came to visit, he would meet his friends at the border. He would not step into the Shire. So that's basically how it works. It's a pretty simple system. There's a mayor, there's a thane, there's sheriffs, there's a postmaster. Okay. All right, next question. In The Lord of the Rings, why was Legolas part of the Fellowship of the Ring? This is actually a good question when you think about it. And we could really only guess. They don't really say... Legolas doesn't become a character, really, until later. He's just sort of there at first in Book 2 when he's introduced. He arrived in Rivendell only to pass on news. He had a message for Elrond that Gollum had escaped from Mirkwood, and he wanted to pass on the message from his father Thranduil that it wasn't their fault, that they were vigilant and that there was an outside circumstance, there were orcs involved. So he passed on his message. Why doesn't he just go home, right? Why does he stick around, and why does he join the Fellowship of the Ring? Why does he want to join? Because you couldn't be conscripted into the Fellowship. And why does Elrond choose Legolas specifically? Elrond admitted that he planned to send 2 of his elves. We don't know who it might have been. It could have been Glorfindel and Eristor. It could have been his sons. Who knows? It could have been characters that just didn't have names at that point. But those 2 got replaced at the last minute by Merry and Pippin. But why would he send Legolas if he was already planning on sending 2 elves? I think Legolas had to have asked to go, and if we were to make a guess as to why Legolas would ask to go, I would guess that he felt that he was a representative of the kingdom of Mirkwood, and him coming there and saying Gollum escaped, even though he's assuring them that it wasn't their fault, he might have felt it was. He might have felt that his land looked bad, and that he had to sort of make up for it, and that part of this mess was their fault. So even if it really wasn't, that may have been how he felt. And when he asked Elrond was probably thinking that there's several good reasons why he would allow that. So, yeah, we can only guess, but I would say that it definitely had to be a choice that Legolas made. Okay. And we're at the last question here, and this is a fun one. Most of them were anonymous this time. I only mention names if the person chooses to reveal that. Why was golf mentioned in the Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey movie? Does the game go back that long? So, of course, golf is kind of an old game in real life. It goes back to the 18th century. But in Tolkien's fictional world, and I must stress that this is a fictional, fantastical world, it was specifically invented by hobbits. Golf was inspired by the actions of Bandabras Took. They called him Bull Roarer. He died about 100 years before Bilbo was born. And he was an unusually large hobbit, and he was an unusually warlike hobbit, and he fought goblins, and he once cleaved off a goblin's head and sent it sailing 100 yards into a rabbit hole. So he killed the goblin and invented golf, or inspired the game of golf. And it should be mentioned that the goblin's name was Golfimble. So the game of hitting a round object, hopefully not a head, into a hole, was inspired by Bull Roarer and was even named after the specific goblin that he slew. So that's all we have here this week. We managed to get it in under an hour this time. I was trying to not pick too many questions, although there were a lot of really great ones. So I'll see you guys next week. Leave me some questions. You can leave me a comment, but if you really want to be featured in a video, just look at the link in the description. There is a link to my Quora account. You can ask the question on Quora. It's very easy to make an account there, and just tag me in it. I'll come up for Tolkien stuff. Just trust me. When you put Tolkien or Middle-earth or anything in as a topic, I'll be there as a person suggested to ask. But just in case, I do have the link directly to my account on there, so you can follow me on there. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, help me grow here. This channel is not partnered. My gaming channel is partnered, but this channel is not yet partnered, and I'd like to get there. I'd like to do more of this. Of course, we do have more content coming out that's not questions. We already have the first part of the iceberg video. We're going to have the second part coming out soon. And I know I said that it would be in 2 parts in the first section, but it's actually in 3 parts because it wound up being so long that I split it into 3 parts. And we have some other stuff on the horizon, so we'll see you guys next time.